Hello and welcome to Gareth Icke Tonight. In November 2020, British nurse Lucy Letby was charged with the murder of 7 infants and the attempted murder of 7 more at the Countess of Chester Hospital in northwest England. The case shocked the nation and Lucy was quickly found guilty and sentenced to a full life term in prison. Letby, who has always maintained her innocence, would never be released. However, in the last 2 years, more and more has come out that's thrown the conviction into doubt. Now, I'll be honest, in my opinion, the whole case stank from the beginning with the sheer lack of evidence or motive and the positive testimony of her colleagues towards her, always making the whole life sentence seem somewhat shaky. In the early days, questioning Lucy Letby's guilt was met with vitriol, with very few having the courage to actually speak their doubts out loud. Journalist Peter Hitchens and former MP David Davis were perhaps the most high profile of those questioning the conviction, with ourselves, Neil McRae of the Unity News Network, and Heritage Party leader David Curtin also taking some online abuse for having the nerve to stick up for a baby killer. Well, the problem with that accusation is that what we're saying is we don't think, or at least we're unconvinced, that Lucy was a child killer. So in fact, we're not speaking up for a child killer at all. And if we're right and Lucy is potentially innocent, then there is someone else out there that's guilty, either premeditated or through malpractice. Speaking out about the legitimacy of the conviction no longer receives the same level of backlash, however. The very minimal and circumstantial evidence against Lucy has all but been debunked, with her presence at all of the deaths being provably false. 14 experts from around the world have spoken out against the conviction, stating that Lucy is innocent. Her ward manager and colleagues have done the same. And now we know that the one smoking gun piece of evidence used to convict her was a lie. The court was told that Lucy was found standing over a baby and the poor child deteriorated and ultimately passed away. Now, the fact Lucy failed to raise the alarm was taken as a serious red flag to persuade the jury of her guilt. But investigations later found emails from the time where the consultant that testified to Lucy's failure to raise the alarm actually stated himself that he was called to the room by Lucy as the child's health was failing. So she did raise the alarm then. There are far too many questions that need answering. There's a young woman rotting away in a prison cell, and there are 7 grieving families that deserve to know exactly what happened beyond reasonable doubt. Our guest this evening joins us from Europe. Sarah Hawkins is an independent advocate working primarily in special education and healthcare. She provides pro bono support to families who have lost babies due, in most part, to poor care within the health service. Sarah will be telling us what really goes on within the prenatal and postnatal care sector and how this feeds directly into the case of Lucy Letby. Sarah believes beyond any doubt that Lucy is innocent. She says she can prove it. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your experience in the realm of hospital care, particularly infant care?
Well, my background is I grew up in southeast London, and I was in and out of care, but I also experienced quite invasive, unnecessary treatment in hospital as a child. And I think for many years, and I have lasting physical issues because of it. So I think maybe my need to make sure that people get the best care and they're not abused within the system started then. And then when I gave birth to my twins in 2015, who were premature, I ran in the opposite direction and walked away, and I was just so happy to have them safe in my arms. But then there was a need for me to, look into what possibly might have happened during my pregnancy and birth, because of my children had needs that were not first identified. And then I began campaigning and working for improvements in care. And I began researching and doing everything I could to speak up and be a voice for the often unheard and silenced.
Because when we hear about a child, dying as a result of hospital negligence or malpractice or whatever, we're understandably outraged, and we assume, I'm sure I assume that it's a very rare occurrence. But just how common is it that something happens, while a child is in hospital or during the birth or something like that?
I think that the sort of basic numbers are about, for stillbirth, is around 3 in 1,000. Interpartum stillbirth, which is while giving birth, is 7% of that number. So in babies dying during birth is a very small number. However, the iatrogenic harm of the way that babies are being born is quite significant. Then we have neonatal deaths, which are incredibly rare, possibly around about 3 a year within a NICU environment. And it's usually because there is some issue that they already know about.
When you work in this sort of realm, obviously you're providing assistance to families and stuff like that. How does that affect you personally? I'm just thinking, even just doing this job here, I interview people, I talk to people, I hear their stories, I take them home with me. I try not to, but I do. That it must be really difficult for you.
It is, and I've supported now in my work, I've supported many, many families that have lost babies, helping them understand why their babies didn't make it. And I've become close to them because I really believe in community, and I do that work, working with families that have lost babies, completely free. And it is heartbreaking, but I'm full of gratitude that they trust me to support them and hold their hands in understanding what happened. And they often will say thank you to me, and it's misplaced thanks, because I see them and I see their children, and I thank them for allowing me the opportunity to help them understand what happened to their precious babies, because they're our community, they're our society, they're our children. Sorry, I'm getting a bit emotional, but they're very, very, very incredible families. And those that lose twins and multiples, it's a very unique type of loss, because when you lose one twin or one multiple, every milestone that you have with the surviving twin and multiple is met with grief. So, when they walk, they talk, when they on their birthday, and then if you have babies that die in utero, they seldom die at the same time. And then if you have babies that die neonatally, again, they seldom die at the same time. So there's no respite from the memories of grief. And I think that also it's important to mention that a lot of twins and multiples are born with difficulties that are discovered later on as they grow up, and it's because of the system.
When you say it's because of the system, what can you explain that? What do you mean by that?
We have ways to support parents expecting twins and multiples. We have the information, we have the technology, we have incredible people that are doing incredible work to protect these vulnerable pregnancies, but they're not by their own design or, physiology entirely at risk. That there are things that we can see that can be treated that can prevent a baby passing away. However, the system is not adopting those strategies. They're not adopting those techniques. They're not listening to the right people. They're listening to people who are invested in areas of research that is looking at whether or not acting when you see an issue or waiting is best. And actually, we know it's very, very well known that in some diseases that twins and multiples get, those that share a placenta, acting now, if you see an issue, is incredibly important, and it saves lives.
On the situation of hospital negligence or malpractice or bad systems, what is your take on Lucy Letby? For people around the world watching this, you may have seen her speak about this quite a lot. She's a British nurse who is now serving life imprisonment. She'll never be released for the murder of 7 children and the attempted murder of 7 more. But the more that comes out, the more questions seem to be raised about the case. Well, what's your take on it?
So I wrote an abstract, and I was campaigning for better care, and I was looking at this increase in stillbirth and perinatal loss in twins and multiples having gone up by 19%. And it's all based off of the findings of a audit that was done in 2015. And that audit found that the stillbirth and perinatal loss of twins and multiples was halved from previous years, but the singletons went up. Since then, almost immediately afterwards, of course, the rates went straight back up. And that's because only certain trusts and hospitals were involved in the audit. So I knew that there was this anomaly in 2015, and I'd written about it, but I hadn't connected the two. When it first came out in the press that she was convicted and sent to prison, I had an incredibly emotional reaction. And I realized that was because it was personal. My feelings, my reaction was one of a personal nature. And now I look back and I regret that, because I just took it on face value. And there was this whole idea that she had targeted twins and multiples. And then very soon after that, I attended one Zoom with Science on Trial, and there were lots of different people that were talking about it. And I only went to one, but it was enough to make me think, maybe there's more to this, but I'm going to reserve judgment. And I carried on with my work, carried on campaigning, carried on all of that. And then in December, I had a reason to go back over my research, and I kept thinking, what happened in 2015? What happened in 2015? Because I had been told that there was some corruption within the stillbirth rates in that time, during that time. And then I literally woke up and I was like, Lucy Letby. And I had a theory. And my theory was, knowing how the stillbirth statistics are collated and how the audit was conducted, which has been edited, I believe, a number of times. The first theory I had was, if you have somebody who's a murderer, then it's not poor care or mishandling of treatment to poorly babies. And then I started to reach out to people who took the very little information that I had and played it off as their own. And then when I discovered that the first babies were not booked, the first 2 twins, which were the first babies, and that there was, I think, 2/3 of the babies were twins and multiples, I began to think, what if those babies were not meant to be born there? what if those babies were having care at a hospital that was part of the audit? And I wanted to be wrong. But the more I looked at the individual cases, the more I realised that babies who were admitted to larger hospitals that were involved, and also those that were under the care of the Countess of Chester, but also having care under other hospitals, specialist care under other hospitals.
Okay, so these children weren't just at this Countess of Chester hospital then?
No. So A and B was booked, and I just want to say before I say anything, I do this work for the families and everybody that's been harmed by this, and that includes Lucy Letby's family and Lucy Letby and her colleagues. A and B were not booked at the Countess of Chester. E and F, who are twins, were admitted to Liverpool Women's and then were transferred after between 2 and 3 weeks to go to the Countess of Chester immediately to be born, because they had a condition that twins who share a placenta have. Those babies, I believe, were incredibly unwell when they went to the Countess of Chester. Having looked at each individual case and situation, I believe that there's no way that they didn't know that there was a risk that those babies would not make it. And if you consider A and B were twins, E and F were twins, I was a twin, their co-twin died in utero. J was a twin, her co-twin died in utero. L and M were twins. And then you have the triplets, and they make up the indictment, part of the indictment.
Wow, this is something that isn't really spoken about, isn't it? The number of twins and of course of triplets. Who do you think Lucy is taking the fall for? Because I'll give you full disclosure. When I saw this case and everyone was going mad and the media were all over it and everyone was outraged, it never sat right with me either, because there just didn't seem to be any evidence.
The evidence is ridiculous at best. It was an emotional case, threshold. It might do against the trust, but not Lucy Letby. And the interesting thing is that I like to think of it as, if you think of, and we talk, going to these 14 experts as well, which I think is important to point out. I find all of that quite bizarre, because if I look at one case like A and B, the allegation there is air embolism, which is incredibly rare, really, really rare. And if you imagine a dartboard, maybe people look at a dartboard, and if you look at, it's got black and white, black and white, black and white all the way around, you've got a pretty good, darts player. And then in between, you've got the red and the green, which you get double points, but it's very hard to hit those. So in the middle, you've got air embolism, Lucy Letby, which is the bullseye. And then they are saying that the cause of the deaths in A and B was potentially from consequence of antiphospholipid syndrome, which is a very rare disease. So what they've done is they've replaced one highly unlikely cause of death with another highly unlikely cause of death, when the mother had other comorbidities as well. And those are the black and the whites that are much more understandable, and conditions that the vast majority of women who have had twins have suffered from.
Why do you think they focus so much on the most unlikely scenarios?
I don't know. I guess that's the big question. Why have they decided not to release the report until next year? You know, why are they not acting now? If she's innocent, and the only potential for me that she's possibly not is if she's implicated in the bigger picture, but I don't see any evidence of that, right? We always have to think about, every angle, I guess, Do I think she's a cold-blooded murderer? No. I think that perhaps what's happened is that you have an area of life and medicine, which is maternity, which is a female domain. And there's a lot of men speaking about it. And there's a lot of egos. And I don't really get involved with all of that. But I do know that it's quite toxic, the whole group around it. But they all have an agenda. Everybody has an agenda. Even I have an agenda. My agenda is being open and speaking up and trying to make a difference because it's still happening. I think that they don't quite understand the implications of a 34-year-old woman being in prison in solitary confinement with the continual noise around it and the effect of that on her, and the fact that maybe one day she had dreams of being a mother herself. And there seems to be no urgency. So even if, which I hope she is released, if she's entirely innocent, I don't think that she would be in prison for as long as she is. If she were even remotely, she might not even be in prison at all, remotely involved. But I think that her life is forever changed, because even if she were to have children and a family of her own, they will be monitoring her continually. She'll be considered to be a safeguarding risk, even if she is entirely exonerated. And I don't think that people have taken any of that into consideration.
Why do you think there is such a reluctance to have a retrial? And because I look at it and I look at the start, there was the odd little bit here and there that was questionable. In the last probably 6 months, it's been one after the other. More evidence has come out. For instance, the consultant saying that the big red flag was that she didn't raise the alarm when a child was deteriorating rapidly, and then they find the emails where that very same consultant has said, "I was called there by Lucy Letby." That to me is like, well, that should be enough on its own to look at it again. Why do you think they're not?
Because it would implicate too many people. It would, if you were to look at the bigger picture, it would potentially implicate an awful lot of people. And the most tragic thing about it is, she was a young woman. She was 10 years ago, 24. And potentially with the training that she had, she was the most competent person to respond to those babies' needs. But she can't diagnose and she can't prescribe. She might, I don't know, I'm pretty sure she wasn't able to prescribe. She, like many nurses, care. They're there to care, and they're there to be responsive and not to treat. The doctors treat. So really, her job was to respond to their needs and take instruction from management. And I don't think that the bigger issue just lies with the management within the Countess of Chester. I think that maybe the focus that it was about them is also a distraction. There's a lot of distractions, and right now I just see an awful lot of information regurgitated, and an entire lack of interest in trying to uncover what potentially is really going on.
What do you think?
I have tried to share what I know.
You say, like, obviously there's, you've got these 14 experts that have written this paper saying that they believe she's innocent. That's, it's being delayed another year. Like you say, that's another year in prison. What would you say? Say, for instance, now we managed to get a retrial and you were able to speak on Lucy Letby's behalf. What do you think is the real smoking gun that would exonerate her, do you think?
I think they need to look at the changes that happened in 2015 and who was in control of those changes in regards to the types of babies that she was caring for. That's what I think. I think that there has been a miscarriage of justice, and I don't believe that miscarriage of justice is over with by her release alone. I don't believe that there was no crime. I believe that it wasn't a crime that was instigated or solely her doing. I think that we have had experts coming forward who have offered their services who are not competent to do so. And among those 14 experts, I found it quite interesting, although I knew before, I said to people, there won't be one obstetrician or fetal medicine doctor because they're too scared. Those that are on the right side of things are too scared to speak up. And they have to consider, this is my opinion, those that could, they are caring for hundreds of women and babies in utero. They're caring for hundreds, if not thousands, and treating them and training people in the expert skills to care for these babies. If they were to speak up about this, potentially they would have to turn them back on all those people that need them. And so that's why I'm doing it. But I believe that there's a lot of fear involved. And I think that even if you're in direct conflict with the beliefs of somebody, or you don't agree with their research practices, or you consider their research to be of not good quality, it's a risk even to speak up about that. If you are on the same side, you're at risk. If you're somewhere in the middle, you're at risk. The risk is too great. The risk is to them too great. And who in their right mind, if I had the skills to save the lives of women and babies, would I step out of that domain to stand with one woman? No. And thank God I'm not. And thank God I've always been independent because I've got nothing to lose. And the families that I've supported that have lost babies, they want to speak to. They want to share their stories. They want to, but they're silenced. And incidentally, one of the main issues with the information about babies and the maternity has been limited by the use of lawful, what do they call it? Lawful. When you put in for a freedom of information request and you don't give something, a lawful basis, there's been a prevention of getting information using a lawful basis justification in GDPR that has stated that they will not give information about multiples because the fact that they are multiples identifies them. No one can get a freedom of information request. And even though I told them you won't get one, and I know why you won't get one, and there's also a twin registry that potentially every set of twins and multiples that were born since 2015 have been added to, and it holds an awful lot of information about them because it's for the purposes of long-term outcomes. And that is held by one single person and with a significant interest in twin studies. And that's different from twin research.
So how do we, I was going to say, how do we fix the NHS? I mean, it's all anyone talks about in politics, and it's normally we're just going to give a load of money, just chuck a load of money at it, which don't see how that fixes anything. But in terms of this situation that we've got now, where I agree with you that there is a toxic environment. We spoke to Victoria Rickson not that long ago. She was was working in a maternity ward, and she said it was toxic, and that if there was any mistakes made, and anyone wanted to sound the alarm and blow the whistle, they were bullied and threatened with the sack, and ultimately were sacked or at least bullied out of the door. This can't continue because you're putting mothers and babies' lives at risk on a daily basis with this.
I know, and that's another issue that I find deeply concerning, is that I am sounding the alarm and no one's listening. And with every day that goes past, women are receiving poor care. And the fact is that pregnancy in and of itself is not risky. I mean, I've supported many, many women pregnant with twins or multiples, and I advocate for them to get the best possible care, and I direct them towards that care. I've never had a stillbirth. I've never had a neonatal death in the women that I've supported. That's not because of me, it's because I sent them to the people that I know can actually support them, and they go to term. I think the toxicity, I don't know. Someone has to care from high up. Someone needs to really care, because all of the methods that we have to monitor, the neonatal death rates or the perinatal mortality or maternal mortality, and the inquiries, the independent inquiries, they're all connected. There's no independence. There's no autonomy. And there always was in maternity. And it upsets me because if I go into maternity wards and, when I used to work as a doula, I used to find that people were quite wary or defensive with me because a lot of, it's from the top down. The toxicity and the need to control and to be right is all the way down. And then the work I did as a doula, I always wanted to be helpful to everybody there in order to ensure that my client was being heard, the person that I was supporting the families that I was supporting were being heard. I wasn't there to have an argument. I wasn't there to get in the way. But it's like a battlefield. Someone that I think would be really interesting for you to speak to, he likened the NICU experience to the Stanford experiment. And it is like that, the way it's set up. If I had the answer, but the problem is that I've reached out to every single person from high up, and you might get this analogy with your background with football and all that kind of stuff. But I was offered whistleblower protections by somebody who works with David Davis, and it never came through. And I was expected to share my information, my research, my evidence with this young neuroscientist. And I was trying to explain to him in basic terms, because I've been very, very bounded and I've not shared anything, because I wanted to be personally safe, which is why, I feel like this is the right platform to, come forward, because if something happens to me now, who cares? But you'll know who I am, and maybe your listeners will know who I am, and they'll know that, what I've got to say might be relevant. But I started explaining it to him, and he said, how does what happens in London affect what happens in Liverpool and Chester? And I said, with the greatest of respect, I'm going to give you a metaphor or an analogy. You asking me that question is like asking me how David Beckham, who was born in Essex, playing for Manchester United, it affects the England team in the European Cup. And he said, I don't watch football. I said, you can't discern my evidence and my research. Because if you cannot understand the basic principle of power and all these sort of pockets of leagues, I guess, and competition, then you won't understand this.
No, I mean, I understand, but even on a real basic level, like if you have a situation where you have a toxic atmosphere, a fearful atmosphere, where if I'm in a position where I'm, caring for a child and I know that if I make a mistake, the whole world is going to come down on me. There's people breathing down my neck. There's pressure. There's this and that. It's a nasty environment to work. The likelihood of making a mistake will be higher because that's just the nature of it. So I think having a relaxed atmosphere should be encouraged anyway. I don't get the toxic, fearful atmosphere where people are supposed to be caring for people. That's never made sense to me.
Well, if you look at a NICU environment and go back to the Stanford experiment, all of the people within the Stanford that participated, they were in the same class, I believe, and those that were in charge really got off on the power. Now, if you go into NICU, it's usually through 2 locked doors, and they also send babies to NICU under what's called a social admission, which is where they have concerns, safeguarding concerns about the parents. They send the babies there. That's a massive risk because infection risk of actually poorly babies. They send them there because it's secure and there's more nurses. But the nurses need to be monitoring the babies that are sick, not policing or carrying out observations on the parents. And that's what they do. They watch the parents. I had 2 families in the NICU that I was in with my children that were there on social admissions. It happens. And when you get inside, it's you've got no choice but to be there because you want to be with your babies. It's the most unnatural experience seeing your baby in a box. If you listen to the song by Athlete, it's beautiful, it's wires, and it's all about his daughter being in NICU. That is exactly how it feels. Every parent remembers the first time they went into NICU, the sounds, the smell, the beeping, and before you even touch your baby, you have to go through a ritual of cleaning your hands and twice, and and once you're in, the doors are locked, and when you come out, the doors are locked, and you've got no power as a parent. You have to trust these people to care for your babies. Now, I got lucky. I went into labour, but I knew that something was wrong with my pregnancy, and I begged for the best care, and I didn't get it. It is my belief that there are mistakes that take place in environments like that. Of course there are. But I don't think that there was any quote unquote mistakes so I keep doing this. In the Lucy Letby case, I think that those babies in the twins and multiples at the very least were incredibly unwell before they were born and were unlikely to make it without specialist care. And that centre, the Countess of Chester, was unable to provide that specialist care. And they incidentally were not participating in any of the national audits.
So do you think then, basically, in the case of Lucy Letby, it's easy for one nurse in her early to mid-30s to take the rap, off you go to prison, wash your hands of the whole affair?
She was in her 20s. She was in her 20s in 2000.
So they've basically sacrificed her to save essentially the hospital and all the higher ups.
I think to protect the interests of those within the NHS that are not isolated to the Countess of Chester. I don't think it's limited to the Countess. I know it isn't. I believe it isn't. I'm pretty sure it isn't.
See, this is something that I wasn't aware of. All I was aware of is that this has happened in this hospital. So you're looking at certain problems they've had at that hospital. They had problems with infections and stuff. They didn't have the staff to cope with such poorly babies. But you're saying obviously these babies are coming in from other hospitals as well. So actually maybe it's not just protecting that hospital; it's protecting an entire trust.
numbers. I believe it's protecting numbers, because I have had families that I've supported who, when they've needed tertiary expert care, they have not had it. In fact, they have either been cared for by somebody who isn't the specialist, twin and multiple specialists within a trust, or they have not been sent to tertiary level centre hospital. And this is after the fact. So they have seen me when I was more, visible on social media, and they reached out to me because they'd lost a baby. And then I started to support them in understanding why. I've heard inside a PMRT meeting, when a baby dies, the hospital marks their own homework. It's them that carries it out. And so you can't win. Parents can't win, and they're silenced, because if you have a baby that's injured, and has a lifelong, condition or difficulty, you've got to the age of 21 to bring that to a civil claim. There's no rush, but during that time, you can't really speak about it. If there is a criminal case, which some of the parents that I know have been arrested because they have spoken up about their baby's deaths. Oh, yeah. And the silencing of these parents is preventing the truth coming out 100%. And if you look at, for example, ENF, they were admitted, the babies, ENF, they were twins that shared a placenta. They were admitted to Liverpool Women's at 27 weeks with TTTS to be monitored. Now, TTTS, if anyone goes and looks on my YouTube, I'll send you a video of a professor talking about how to treat it. You have to act now. If you see it, you have to act now, not wait, not conservative management. And there has been studies into whether or not to act now or conservative management, which is watch and wait. That was a level 3 NICU. They are part of a network that has other level 3 NICUs. I've known babies in utero to pass away en route to hospital. It is a very, very fast and progressive disease. And at 29 plus 2, I believe, I would have to look at my notes to be absolutely accurate, those babies were sent to the county to Chester because they needed to be born today. And that hospital did not have the infrastructure, the capability, the expertise to care for those babies. So either those babies were not meant to be born there, which we have found, or they had care between the County of Chester and tertiary level hospitals, or it was either one of those two in terms of the twins and multiples. It either they weren't booked there or there was shared care with a tertiary level centre hospital. And incidentally, the triplets, they were monochorionic, which means that they all shared a placenta. That is a 1 in 100,000 pregnancy. It is incredibly high risk. It's one of the highest risk pregnancies ever.
And none of these things are anything to do with Lucy Letby, are they? Absolutely. She would have no control or anything over any of this.
No. She was caring for incredibly unwell babies. And the doctors as well, I don't think, had any specialism in caring for twins and multiples, because the conditions that they can develop in utero, the neonatologists need to understand them to know how to care for those babies accurately. And I don't think they did. From the evidence that I've seen, from the information that I've managed to gather, which I cross-reference everything. I use the Thirlwell inquiries, I use freedom of information requests that are held in the public domain, I use audits, I use projections, I use accounts, I use Companies House. I research this stuff to make sure that what I'm saying is legitimate. And so the fact that you have just said that she had no control over those things, absolutely not. No control whatsoever. She was a young, passionate, caring nurse who tried herself to raise the alarm many times. and they didn't listen. In fact, they became defensive, like they have done with me. And then, especially, if you're, from a very simple background, dare I say it, a woman, a young woman, you become the problem.
Do you think
they
she'll
make
ever?
You the problem.
Do you think she'll ever be released, Sarah? Do you think that this will ever come out enough to ensure that? I know I'm asking you a crystal ball question. I get that.
I think if we all stand together, and I have an awful lot of families who are willing to step forward, if we all stand together and campaign, I think she will. I think with those that are the biggest voices around it currently, I think it's unlikely. What you've done is you've replaced air embolism, for example, with A and B, with a consequence of antiphospholipid syndrome. When the mother had gestational hypertension and cholestasis and was carrying twins, those things, most twin mothers have had cholestasis or know that it's a big risk. A lot of women who've been pregnant have had gestational hypertension or preeclampsia. So that's not rare. So if you was to, talk about the black and the white of the dartboard, cholestasis, gestational hypertension or preeclampsia, the vast majority of the population is going to understand what those two conditions are. But once you start talking about a rare condition like antiphospholipid syndrome potentially causing the death of the babies, you're replacing a bullseye with another fucking bullseye. And it's just a red herring. Yes, Shu Lee, great. He wrote a paper. I don't even know how Julie Evans found it. I think it was from a way back when, maybe they used Wayback Machine, but, he misappropriated the study. And Julie, could step forward and say that study, he misappropriated the study and misunderstood it. This is what he actually said. But actually to turn around and then say, but I think it was the antiphospholipid syndrome is a bit of a leap when there are far more, just an obvious and more common reasons why those babies would have been as tall as they were.
Sarah, where can people learn about your research and more about what you do? Because obviously you've mentioned a YouTube channel, which I know obviously you're putting out information regularly. Where can people find you?
Well, to be honest with you, I haven't really been putting out a lot of information recently, just because I've been afraid. I'm independent, as I say. I've got a family, and so I am a whistleblower. But because I've always been independent, I can't get any of the protections. So, hope that people watching this will consider that I'm valuable and my children are valuable enough to protect, and the information that I've got is valuable enough to protect. We are going to start publishing on a podcast, myself and my colleague called Shannon Evans and Elizabeth Castle, on a podcast that is going to be called 6 Months Investigates. And we're going to be doing a Lucy Letby series talking about the Lucy Letby case. But I do have information on YouTube that is from previous conversations that I've had with eminent doctors and influential people, and that is at Doula Sarah on YouTube. But you can also find me on TikTok, but those are mostly me making a twat of myself and falling over and being ridiculous.
Well, I think that's what TikTok's for, Sarah, if I'm honest. But thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been great to talk to you, and I hopefully I'll talk to you again in the future. As more and more stuff comes out, it's funny, like I was saying at the top of the show, like it's gone from questioning the Lucy Letby conviction, got you all kinds of vitriol, all kinds of names and all this kind of stuff, to now actually more and more people are going, yeah, there's something off here. So I'm hoping the more people that question it, the more pressure is put on.
The better, and the one person that has shown me huge amounts of grace is Richard Gill, and he's had 2 cases overturned in Europe, and he thinks that what I've got to say is valuable. And we are stuck in a bit of a loop of the same information being regurgitated. And actually, I think that this is incredibly important, because I think that once this is out, or once people actually start looking at in the right place, rather than just looking at why she isn't guilty, or, disproving the reasons, the ridiculous reasons that were given, that there are a huge amount of alternative causes that were present in the physiology of the babies that caused the loss. I think that she will potentially be should possibly have her conviction overturned and will be out sooner rather than later. And I think that people have to consider that she has a life to lead, and everybody involved, every single person, and I'm not making allegations about any single person. I think it's a system, it's a group of people, and forget those, but those that are victims of it, they all matter. And I think that in the UK right now, we don't have an awful lot of value in people, other humans, as sentient beings who have any value. And it was a relief for me when one of my children became poorly and we were in Spain and we accessed medical care. And it was like going back 20 years, because people gave a shit. They were so compassionate. They cared. They value human life. That doesn't exist in the NHS right now in any area. I'd sooner die than go to A&E.
No, well, I've had multiple surgeries throughout my life because of football injuries, but I look at the NHS throughout COVID and I just find myself shaking my head, to be honest. But Sarah, thank you so much for joining us. It's been great to talk to you, and I will talk to you again in the future, I'm sure, as more and more comes out.
Yeah, we need to get this stuff out, Gareth. Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it.
That's all for this week. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed last week's episode of Bring the Fire with National Residents Association founder Cassie Langford. If you haven't watched the episode, it's live on Ickonic now. This coming Sunday, I'm joined by former Labour MP Chris Williamson. We'll be talking about the state of the UK, Israel's war on Gaza, and his expulsion from the Labour Party back in 2019 as part of the manufactured anti-Semitism crisis that brought down former leader Jeremy Corbyn. The episode goes live at 10 a.m. UK on Sunday on Ickonic.com. Until then, have a great week. Take care of yourselves. Good night.